Salams from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief. First up on the show today, Russia on Thursday said it hopes representatives of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, will soon be able to visit the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to defuse the crisis that is ongoing there. An IAEA visit has been on, or at least in the planning stages, since back in June 2022 and would have already taken place, according to Russia, had it not been for the interference or sort of involvement of the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. This is according to Ivan Nechayev, a deputy spokesman for Russia's foreign ministry, and he shared these thoughts at a news briefing in Moscow yesterday. On the possibility of establishing a demilitarized zone around the plant, the spokesman said this was not an option at this stage because Ukraine could attempt provocations and attacks to pin the blame on Russia. Nechayev accused Ukrainian forces of carrying out several strikes on the plant, which is Europe's largest nuclear facility of its kind, over the past few days. Meanwhile, on the other side, the United States of America announced a new $775 million military aid package for Ukraine. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, and I quote, "President Biden has been clear that we will continue to support the people of Ukraine in defending their country from Russia's aggression for as long as it takes," end quote. Prabir Purkayastha, NewsClick's editor-in-chief, was in studio a little while ago to clear up some of the confusion on this critical situation. Prabir, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant very much a focal point of all of the media conversation around the war in Ukraine. What is the clear current danger?
You know, that's a very important question to raise because Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant is one of the largest in the world and certainly the largest in Ukraine. So you are looking at a plant which has the capability, if it blows up, destroying or making a huge region in Europe, particularly in Ukraine and in the Donbass area, unlivable. So the consequences of this for southern Ukraine, for Europe, other countries is enormous. You know, why is a war zone in and around a nuclear plant so dangerous? After all, this plant has been under Russian occupation, by all accounts, from March. It seems that recently the plant was shelled, it's been attacked. Now, shelling of a nuclear plant, what are the consequences? You can argue, of course, you know, the walls are very thick, you know, the dome is there, what will happen? Nothing much will happen. But the point is not that. The point is when a nuclear plant blows up, it doesn't blow up because you've shelled it. What happens is, for instance, if all power supply, both egress and ingress, say gets destroyed, okay? If that happens, then you have to shut the nuclear plant down without any power. Or that means that you have to have DG sets which work. Well, we don't know that they will work after the shelling. So you can have a situation where you try emergency measures to shut the nuclear power plant down, but you can't cool the plant. And if you can't cool the plant, if the coolant system goes, as we know what happened in the Fukushima disaster, that's exactly what happened. Not that the plant, they could not shut it down, the cooling system got affected or didn't come on. And once that happened, slowly the heat built up meant that the nuclear core starts melting and you have a core meltdown. And that is when to put it very mildly, shit hits the fan. And if then nuclear, it's really like not a nuclear bomb, but a dirty bomb, then it can then lead to explosions. The consequence would be what exactly happened in Chernobyl. Large amount of radioactivity spills out to the atmosphere and nearby regions, and it could be large. Chernobyl was a large area, only one reactor. Here there are 6.
Multiple reactors.
So if that happens, then a large part of Europe would be contaminated by radioactivity, and this obviously has generational problems. It doesn't go away in a day. It will continue because radioactive is a very long life. So some of these radioactive isotopes which will be released can last for hundreds of years, maybe even up to 1,000 years. So this is the risk that the Zaporizhzhia plant, if it is shelled, bombed, or destroyed by any military action would have on the entire region. It would also have on Ukraine. Of course, it would also have in southern Ukraine as well as the Donbas region, and not only on Russia, but also other European countries.
Absolutely.
Just like Chernobyl did. So this seems to be the fact that this has been allowed to happen, that it does seem, now if we talk about shelling, Russia has got this plant under its control right in the beginning. In March, they took control over Zaporizhzhia. They have been supplying electricity still to the Ukraine grid. It is connected to the Ukrainian grid, not to the Russian one. So they have been supplying electricity out of that. So why should it be now bombed or shelled is the question. And it does appear Ukraine fears that Zaporizhzhia plant will be disconnected from the Ukrainian grid and connected to the Russian grid. And to stop that, they have now created this situation by which Russia is forced to perhaps talk to Ukraine via IAEA and resolve this issue, and continues to supply power free to Ukraine and maintain it for the benefit of the Ukrainian grid. This could be a reason, or it could be that Ukraine has got nowhere with this so-called Kherson initiative, which was supposed to be taking over southern part of Ukraine, back, recapture it from Russia. And having got nowhere, they want something to show for what they have done. And it seems that they were the ones who were shelling the Zaporizhzhia plant, though a lot of the papers reported it, that Russia, who has occupied the plant, is still shelling it. Now, this makes no sense.
Yeah, that was in fact going to be my second question, that who is it principally? What do we understand as posing the danger? But since you've already taken care of that, we can look ahead maybe to next steps of how this critical, it is an issue that needs to be resolved. Whether how the wider peace conversation proceeds is a secondary matter, but this is a more immediate flashpoint. So how do you think that diplomatic effort will proceed?
Well, there has to be a certain degree of honesty about what is happening.
Right.
And that we don't still see happening. And the Ukrainians, for instance, went on initially to say Russia was shelling the plant. And the New York Times and Washington Post and other international agencies all were reporting Russia is in control of the plant but is also shelling it. This was across the board, this was the reporting coming.
Right.
Now, obviously, it was from the Ukrainian sources. Now they have started saying that actually it is being nearby areas or across the river, shelling is taking place from within Zaporizhzhia plant. Now, you know, Russian forces are there in southern Ukraine, and they are there in a much larger area than just a small Zaporizhzhia plant. Why would they be shelling from inside the nuclear installation, which they know is highly dangerous? So these are completely unbelievable claims that are being made. The issue is that Zaporizhzhia plant is being used as a threat, that if you don't do certain things, we can destroy Zaporizhzhia plant, yes, we will suffer, so will you. And so will be the entire southern area that you have captured, including Crimea and Sevastopol port. So it seems to be a kind of Samson threat. Okay, the pulling down the temple and killing yourself is the kind of threat that Ukraine seems to be handing out. Russia went to the United Nations Security Council on this issue. As you know, they were really stopped from any discussions. And now IAEA is come into play, as you were saying earlier. And also the United Nations, the Secretary General is there in Ukraine at the moment. The conditions that is being now put is that it should take place through Kiev. That it's okay, IAEA should inspect the plant, but as Russia has been asking, but the inspection should somehow go through Kiev. This is one argument being made. I don't really know what it means or why this is such a sticking point. But the other part, I think that's a very important one. The continuation of electricity supply to Ukraine should be there, and it should not be disconnected from the Ukraine grid and connected to Russia. So it seems that the immediate trigger was the threat that Zaporizhzhia, which is, as you know, the biggest nuclear plant in Ukraine, the considerable amount of its supply, I think 10% of the supply to the grid of Ukraine was coming from Zaporizhzhia, that should continue. So Russia really should give power to Ukraine from the Zaporizhzhia plant and not disturb that, while maintaining it, bearing all the expenses of running it, etc., etc. So essentially, demand for free power. Now, Ukraine has got away with it a number of times. You know, gas, for instance, they're taking free gas for letting gas go to the European Union. So I think this seems to be one of the famous Ukrainian demands, that give us what we want and we will give you nothing in return, which is what has been their policy for a long time. Now, of course, they're playing the NATO countries on the same vein. Give us arms, bear all our expenses, and we will fight to the last Ukrainian to help you defeat Russia. So this seems to be the game plan at the moment. But the risk to the world and risk to this region is enormous. And the fact that the European Union and the United States seems to be willing to play along with this game, including the United Nations Security General, is really unthinkable, because the consequences can be so great for the world.
Right. And like you were mentioning, they keep on giving. US aid, we now learn, is going to cross the $10 billion mark, military aid in this context. Thanks very much, Prabir, for that perspective on what exactly is going on around one of Europe's biggest nuclear facilities. Next up, a former Attorney General of Mexico, Jesus Murillo, has been arrested in relation to the disappearance of 43 students back in 2014. He's the most prominent individual arrested so far in this infamous case that the country's Truth Commission has now deemed a state-sponsored crime. Excuse me. Murillo was arrested at his home in Mexico City on Friday on charges of forced disappearance, torture and obstruction of justice in the abduction and disappearance of student teachers in the southwestern state of Guerrero on September 24, 2014. The Commission for Truth and Justice was set up by the current Mexican government, headed by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, to investigate a plethora of crimes and human rights abuses committed by Mexican security forces and the Mexican military, supposedly under the garb of fighting drug dealers and drug cartels. Prashant is in studio now to tell us more about the case and why it's so important for Mexico and I suppose in general as well. So Prashant, high-profile arrest in a case that is also extremely high-profile. What is the significance of this particular action on the part of the government?
Right. So this arrest is preceded by a series of announcements also which have been taking place regarding this case. Now we'll come to the significance of the case much later, but like you said, the former Attorney General, the most high-profile person arrested in this case so far. Until now, we have had police officers, other officers of the government, for instance, being arrested. And the unfortunate fact is that despite all that, we have come no closer to the truth. Now, the series of announcements that declarations that came out, there was a statement about this that came out recently from the Truth Commission on this case are very important. First of all, it says that the state was involved in this crime. Now, it's important to note that all this while, for many years, the dominant narrative was that this was a crime that happened at a local level, right? So 43 students, like you said, had commandeered a bus to go to a protest against education reform. Very important to note that. At some point, they were basically kidnapped and then never heard from again. Now, for the longest time, the government, various authorities tried to say that, hey, what happened was that this was as some kind of a drug mix-up that happened. Right. Some local police officers collaborated with local gang leaders and basically disappeared the students, and we really don't know what happened, and they tried to brush it off.
Crime was committed. That's about
exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas what the most recent revelations have proved are very important. The fact that at the highest levels of authority, the federal state was involved, either consciously or through neglect or omission, so to speak. So even if they didn't actually commit the crime at the higher levels, they definitely did not. They were negligent about it. Also, the fact, for instance, that the military had actually infiltrated that group, and one of their agents was in that group.
Right.
And while standard procedure would dictate that in such a situation, the military would try to find out what happened to their agent. In this case, they did not. So there's this wide variety, or this plethora, like you said, of collaboration between various sections of the state in order to ensure that this case was completely buried. And this is why it's so important, because the question of justice never really has been answered for 43 families, for the families of these 43 students. There has been no justice. They have been protesting relentlessly for over these years. Of course, once AMLO came to power, that's President Andrés Obrador came to power, he said that there would be action taken, but even that was going a bit slowly. But now we really seem to have reached a decisive turning point here.
And it's not often that governments, even if it's a different regime, really come out and say that the state was involved in the commission of serious crimes. So it's a significant case in that sense. What brings so much focus on it for this government?
Right. So there's a whole history, of course, of violence related to drug cartels and all. There are a lot of people who have been disappeared over the years in Mexico. And this case, if it actually proceeds in a much more systematic way, in fact, the Truth Commission has said that this is not the closure of the investigation. They have said that there is a need to find out more. To this day, very, very important to note, we really don't know anything about the students. We don't even know where they were buried, where they were killed, where they were murdered. It's not very clear, right? And the earlier governments, for instance, earlier authorities gave some generally vague answers. This time, the Truth Commission specifically acknowledged that there is no possibility that they are alive, but the remains still haven't been found. I believe only 2 or 3 students' remains have been found. So for all these families, it's a question. It's also a question of even to come close to closure, so to speak. You need some amount of idea of really what happened, who was responsible, right? So these steps actually, including the arrest of the former Attorney General, mark a very decisive moment in terms of actually addressing the grief that these families feel, addressing the trauma that they've endured over these years. And like I said, almost every year they've had these protests. Every occasion they've sort of raised these demands. So this is definitely in that way a step forward. But the key question really is that will it continue and reach its logical conclusion? There's not the record of convicting people is not that great perhaps in Mexico. So it will require a lot of political will as well, because you're taking on not only drug cartels and the influence they have, but also the established political party, because the former Attorney General was a key member of a very powerful party. So it's also that establishment you need to sort of, the government and this system needs to take on. And that's why it's sort of, this is why this case is really watched, because in some senses it's an emblematic case. The fact that students who were going for a protest were so almost callously disappeared. And so their fate was so callously treated that it was just say, oh, there were some drug people involved, oh, there were some local officials involved, and it was completely closed. Whereas it was very clear that this issue was being watched by multiple agencies. That is what the report says. Many people were aware of it, but chose not to act about it. The students' lives could have been saved. That is probably the key thing to remember here. And the fact that various arms of the Mexican state chose not to take that action is really as severe an indictment as it gets. So whether it will end with the Attorney General, whether it will go to higher levels of politicians who are in power, then also a very important question to watch. But all in all, I think it's a heartening development for those in People's Dispatch. We've been writing about it. We've been covering the story, the struggles of the families. So in some senses, this is definitely a decisive moment. But the big question is, can the state and can the prosecution authorities move forward on this?
See it through.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much, Prashant. And finally, Article 51A of the Constitution of India provides for the development of, I quote, scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry and reform as a fundamental duty of every citizen. India's is perhaps the only constitution in the world that expressly mentions scientific temper. August 20 is commemorated as National Scientific Temper Day by the All India People's Science Network. On this day in 2014, in the city of Pune, in Western India, social activist and rationalist Narendra Dabolkar was assassinated by unidentified gun-wielding assailants for promoting scientific temper and for opposing superstitions. Following this, left-wing politician Govind Pansare and Kannada academic M.M. Kalburgi were killed in 2015. In 2017, journalist and activist Gauri Lankesh was assassinated in very similar manner. All of them stood strongly and spoke widely against divisive politics, obscurantism, superstition, and for the need for the citizenry to take a scientific approach. D. Raghunandan of the Delhi Science Forum spoke to me earlier via video conference. Raghu, welcome to Daily Debrief. Thanks very much for joining us today to talk about the issue of scientific temper in a country such as India. Because we are predominantly going out to an international audience, can you give us some context in terms of why those who came up with the constitution of an independent India wanted to include this as a value that citizens should be encouraged to develop?
Yeah. So the idea was basically that when the Indian Constitution was framed in the aftermath of independence, India embarked on a path of development that was largely based on self-reliant development, with science and technology taking the lead, and industrial policy being framed in that context. So this was a very forward-looking, scientifically based industrial policy. And India then adopted a science policy resolution, an industrial policy resolution. And India also then felt that all this was not possible unless we also imbibed values of science or a scientific approach. Doesn't mean that everybody had to be Einstein or Newton, but that people adopted a scientific approach to their view of life. That is evidence-based thinking and critical thinking. Then India would be able to develop as a democratic nation with science and technology taking the lead. That was the idea. But many years, many years after, India then inserted into the constitution the provision that effort would be made to develop the scientific temper, which is another term for a scientific approach, among the citizens of the country.
Right. So coming from there, Raghu, to today, first of all, if you can, again, how did you or did the scientific community mark this day in memory of those who have encouraged this process, having been so brutally targeted? And what are the challenges faced by the scientific community and at large, how they reflect on where the country is headed?
Yeah. So, although India had adopted these resolutions and formal statements in the constitution, frankly speaking, the Indian state or the government, successive governments, had not done very much to build the scientific approach among the citizens, except to hold the odd scientific exhibitions, etc. But I think, as you would appreciate, just because you know science doesn't mean you have a very rational or a scientific approach to life. Yeah. There are many scientists among us who are as superstitious as the next man, and who are scared if a black cat crosses their path or whatever. So the effort to develop scientific temperament among the people had not made much headway. However, under the present right-wing, what we call Hindutva-vadi or political dispensation in our country, we are facing a new challenge in that these forces are really revanchist forces who promote traditionalism, who promote traditional values, and who promote a sense of authority, which is often not a secular scientific authority based on expertise, but is a quasi-religious authority based on received wisdom and traditional authority structures. And they are encouraging those as against encouragement to critical thinking and a scientific approach. And we suffered through this in the last many years. We've had attacks on universities, which are famous for critical thinking, where right-wing forces attacked the campuses for bringing in discussions and lectures and visiting professors who were critical of government. Writers who wrote articles critical of government were attacked and criticized for being anti-national. That is, the government being associated with the nation as such. And then you had a series of very unfortunate incidents where a set of rationalists who worked very actively to promote a scientific temper, starting with Dr. Narendra Dabholkar, was assassinated on August 20th, 5 years ago. Today, because of his rationalist and for evidence-based thinking. And this murder was followed in rather quick succession by the murder of 3 other such rationalists and promoters of a scientific approach. So that the assault on evidence-based thinking and rational approach had gone very far in our country, and therefore social movements such as ours decided to observe 20th August every year as the National Scientific Temper Day. and we organize a series of activities across the country to promote critical thinking and to encourage the public to weigh every issue that they face, every piece of observation that they make, to test it with regard to evidence and to arrive at their own conclusions about it and not be afraid to ask questions, because that is the foundation of how you come to understand reality, and which lies at the heart of the scientific approach.
Thank you very much then, Raghu, for joining us on National Scientific Temper Day and sharing that historical perspective as well as what's happening in the current country today. That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief, and that does it for this week as well. We'll be back again on Monday. But for more details on these stories, head over to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and give us a follow on the social media platform of your choice. Like I said, we'll be back on Monday with another episode of the show. Until then, stay safe. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.